you everybody for coming at this late afternoon spot, because I'm sure there are happy hours calling and beckoning, but this is far better stuff, yes. Believe me. My name is Nick Gerlich, and I've got some of my partners in crime here. We're going to have a nice little roundtable discussion, talk about certain aspects of a new book that's coming out about our favorite show. So you'll get a chance to ask some questions, pick up a few insights, and of course share your insights about the shows and its characters. I'm going to go down the line here and just kind of briefly, or let everybody introduce themselves. I'll start here since I'm already talking. I'm Nick Gerlich. I'm a professor of marketing at West Texas A&M, and you got to pardon my voice. I just kind of lost it today. But anyway, I'm happy to be here talking about my favorite show. And mark your calendars now. Come back in about 3 or 4 years. We'll be doing the same thing about Better Call Saul. All right, Susan.
Susan Johnston, Department of English, University of Virginia.
And I'm Bridget Cowlishaw, and I've liberated myself from academia, but I used to be a professor of rhetoric, and
I'm Ian Dawe, an independent scholar from Vancouver.
And Brian Cowlishaw, I'm an English professor at Northeastern State in Oklahoma.
And since Bridget is the editor of our forthcoming book, Breaking Bad and Masculinity, I'm going to hand the beaker over to her and let her kind of run things here.
I wanted to say also that we're being taped by Mark Valdez, who wrote the book on Breaking Bad locations. And if you have a vehicle and you're able to drive around and see some of the locations, his book is the book. It is every little detail. He knows that what the species, the phylum of the beetle that Jesse was playing with on the sidewalk.
I had to look it up.
But you did.
But you did. And so, yes, and we have a book forthcoming from McFarland Press. It's not on their table, and neither is the spring catalog, but they currently have out this anthology on the methods of Breaking Bad. It's a collection of essays. Ours is a little more focused. It's called Breaking Bad and Masculinity, generic title.
What date is that book coming out?
I'm glad you asked. It's coming out on Tax Day. It's coming out on April 15th, so take your tax refund to go get that. It's a collection of essays by who's present and 2 others who are not present, and those were chapters that we can maybe reference, but the conversation we wanted to have tonight is one that would include everybody, because we wanted to have give and take. I'm first going to ask everybody to discuss, just briefly describe for everybody what your chapter in the book was. Is that it's a book about masculinity and Breaking Bad, which is self-evidently largely a theme, and so each one of the authors of the chapters had a very specific definition of masculinity or aspect of masculinity that they wanted to focus on. And I wrote the annotated bibliography, because Breaking Bad needed an annotated bibliography out there, more than anything, and so we've got that now. And so why don't we just start, Nick, why don't you start with your chapter?
My co-author of my chapter, Lori Westermann, was unable to be here at this session, but the 2 of us wrote our chapter entitled Businessman. And since I'm a business professor, it kind of just happened. It was natural here. So we wrote from the perspective of, this is a classic case study in business. In fact, I have used Breaking Bad in my marketing classes, not to promote meth or illicit activity or anything like that, but to show how even simple little operations run out of an RV or a garage or whatever still have very practical business applications, and there were many in this. One of the things that we picked up on was that business still, to this day, is kind of it's an old boys thing, and it's been difficult. We're getting there, but we've got a ways to go for women to reach the corner office as much as men do. And in spite of the fact that on most U.S. universities, it's now about 60-40 women to men as the student body goes. In business school, it seems like it's the last one. We're still more boys than there are girls. It's just one of those things. Change comes slowly, but it is happening. Yet, in Breaking Bad, we saw that Walter fit the stereotypical role of a guy entering business. And as it stood, it was a take no prisoners kind of mindset. Just as it is in business, same in Breaking Bad. We settle conflicts with bullets and knives and box cutters and things like that. And that's how things were done. And right or wrong, it made for an interesting storyline. Now, we also picked up on just some of the basic aspects of business. Things, the nuts and bolts of a introduction to business class are everywhere in this show. Things like product. What kind of purity level was he hitting on? He wanted over 99%. I mean, this was the ivory dishwashing soap of meth. And that's what he wanted. And he was bound and determined to do it at any expense. Distribution was huge. He knew he had to have a network, but he also wanted to control it. This is just, he was like Walmart. You know, he wanted to rule the channel. But it turned out he was the maker as well. Price, he knew how to play that game. And he knew how to play the promotion game. It was just like being in business. Except in this instance, he went from being an amateur cook to a CEO, an empire builder. He also knew the value of the brand. He wasn't Walter White, he was Heisenberg. TM, you know, that was it. He was the brand, and he approached it from a very masculine perspective. In contrast, though, we picked up on the fact that Walter kind of wore two hats. He wore, of course, the hat of the powerful CEO, the drug kingpin, and yet he kind of came from a much softer side of Walter. 50-year-old husband and father, pregnant wife, dead-end high school chemistry job. Not that that's a bad thing, but he was pretty much a domesticated, middle-aged man stuck in a, you know, just a mediocre suburban existence. Not a whole lot to be bragging about if you're going through a bit of a midlife health crisis, right? And so we noted that transition from the domestic side of Walter White to this all-powerful, very he-man drug kingpin who was bound and determined to take anybody else down, who managed to get in his way. The man who at the end may have been trying to craft a charade that he did it for his family, but in the end realized and admitted that he did it for himself. He was good at it, and he kind of liked it. All right, thank you.
And your chapter, Susan, dealt with familyman.
Well, and I just listening to Nick, I was thinking it's interesting that where I began with that chapter was thinking about that moment where Gus says, well, a man provides, right? And I thought, well, yeah, but not like you, Gus, please, not like you. And so what I was interested in was the idea of the father, this provider figure. What is that masculinity that we see in fatherhood? And it's got, I think, at least two sides in the Breaking Bad story. One of the sides is extraordinarily toxic. But the other side is, in the chapter, I use a term from an emerging scholar, Jamie Paris, who's at University of British Columbia. Watch for all his work, he's brilliant, and he talks about custodial masculinity, right? This masculinity that is oriented to an ethics of care, that is loving and responsive to the needs of an other, which other is not, you know, some kind of extension, the way Jesse is for Walt, the way Walter Jr. fails to be for Walt, of his own needs and desires and ambitions, but is in fact an end in himself. Right? That's the idea of custodial masculinity that Paris advances. And I think it's an idea and an ideal of a fatherhood that's kind of woven through the entire series. So that's possibly more honored in its failure than in its success. I think that idea of the custodial masculinity as we know it in the idea of fatherhood is, for me, really central to the experience of men in the series.
And I'll be asking you about some of the father-son relationships in a minute. And Ian, your chapter, actually no, we have overrepresentation here by Ian because he's authored two chapters. One of them dealing with Breaking Bad as a Western. and the concept of masculinity as family man versus outlaw. And then the other dealt with, well, our author did, why don't you?
So I overcompensated and did 2 chapters, and one is about, and if you want, I'm actually presenting this paper tomorrow. It's on Breaking Bad and legacy, male legacy. Legacy is an important overarching theme, and it's a preoccupation certainly of the characters, particularly this middle-aged male characters who are worried about what of them will survive their deaths, what idiosyncratic representation of their values will remain active in the world after they die. And they're certainly all interested in that to one extent or another. And besides that, legacy provides us a way to read certain characters in the show that can be illuminating. One of my big sort of dramatic slides, I'll just give it away because you told me to, was the more I thought about Gus Fring and looked at his history, what we're told of it, which is very little. And part of that was actually a conversation I had with Giancarlo Esposito, trying to pull out of him what were you talking about there. But I think it's Gus Fring, for example, could represent America's legacy in Latin America. You know, Gus, if you track what happened, and I was digging through declassified CIA documents and all this kind of stuff about what happened in Chile in 1986 and 87, around the time that Gus was supposed to have left and came through the Mexican border when it was porous, came to a socioeconomic situation in the United States where there was a demand for meth, and he gave the people the product they want. Gus Fring exists because of America's actions. So that's one of my chapters. The other chapter about postulating a way to read Breaking Bad as a Western, as it revolves around these male characters, is really about comparing the two, or at least 2 of, the major categories of Western, the Italian or spaghetti Western, and the American Western. And they both present us with very different moral landscapes, those 2 Westerns. In the spaghetti Western, it's all shades of gray. And everybody is preoccupied with their own sort of future, and there really isn't any family value orientation there. Whereas in the American Western, there's this faith that there are rules, that this is a nation in ascendancy, right? Whereas with the spaghetti Westerns, I always thought they were representing a culture in decay, a world in decay. Whereas in American Westerns, it's a world being built up, being based on solid values, where the cavalry will come and save you at the end. And basically it breaks down to thinking about Walter thinks he's in an American Western, whereas all the rest of the characters realize they're in a spaghetti Western. Walter thinks, you know, I'm a family man, I did it all for my family, therefore I'm going to get away with it, right? Therefore I'm a good guy. Whereas all the rest of them, you know, especially Mike, would say, Walter, let me explain to you. There are rules, and of course, since the spaghetti Western is based in a large part, as I'm sure a lot of you know, on Japanese cinema, the samurai cinema, there are very old rules, very old rituals, being, you know, you take care of the guys in jail, for example. And this is all very foreign to Walter, who's like, no, I'm a homesteader. That's another thing, for example. He has the White House, the homestead, that he thinks he fights to defend. He doesn't really. His real homestead is the RV, the crystal ship. That's what he, you know, and what it represents to him. That's freedom. That's a covered wagon, you know, that's meant to essentially bring him success in his terms. So those are my 2 chapters in the broad straight outlines, I think. Is that right?
And why don't you introduce your chapter?
Okay, my chapter is about the stereotype of masculinity in our culture, and the particular ways in which it's toxic, which, you know, Walter finally sort of achieves that ideal in a lot of ways, and that's the problem. That's the whole tragedy right there. In particular, I examine the way that stereotype is in sort of polar opposition to the stereotype of the nerd or the intelligent man, the particularly intelligent man. There's a book called, that's half memoir and half sociological study, called American Nerd, The Story of My People, which is good. And they have a definition of nerd, which is short enough that I can read it here. Disproportionate